Today we're going to talk about the CSS Box Model. The CSS Box Model is the construct that allows us to think about HTML elements when we are designing and laying out our page. CSS Box Model is the thing that allows us to conceptualize how much space an individual element takes up. In HTML, you can think of all elements as being surrounded by a box. So if you look at the picture here, you'll see in the center we've got our content. So that's the natural amount of space that an element would consume. But around that, you'll see that there are other areas. One is called the padding, one is called the border, and one is called the margin. So when we say CSS Box Model, what we're talking about is we think about HTML elements as boxes, and that there are optional areas that wrap around your content that you can control to make sure that your design and layout are as you want them to be. So this CSS Box Model that I'm describing for you today is the one that's been around since the very beginning. But there have been some changes. Particularly, there's a box sizing property you can use now to change the way that the box model works on your page. But for today, we're talking about the tried and true old school CSS Box Model. Every element can be thought of as a box that has content, padding, border, and margin. So the CSS Box Model describes this quote-unquote box that every element is contained within. And the dimensions of each part of that box, when you sum them up, determines the total dimensions that something takes up on the page. So if you add the content, the margin, border, and the padding all together, you get the width and height of the element itself. And so that's what we're talking about today. So there are four distinct areas of the box model. There's the content, which is the real content. You can think of this as an image, let's say, with a particular width and height. And then there's an optional padding, or a space around your content that you can set or configure. And then there's a border, which is also optional, followed by margin. And margin is the space between elements. You add all those together, you have the complete space that an element consumes. This is what we refer to as the CSS Box Model. So I have a little analogy here for you. So let's say I had a box and I had Grumpy Cat in it. That is my content. Now if I put some packing peanuts around Grumpy Cat, that becomes my padding. Okay, remember the padding is the area, the optional area between the content and the border. You can think of, in this case, as the box being sort of like a border around Grumpy Cat and his padding. And then let's say we had another Grumpy Cat that we were packaging. The space between Grumpy Cat 1 and Grumpy Cat 2 would be thought of as the margin. Okay, so this is our CSS Box Model Grumpy Cat style. CSS Properties. In order to work with this box model, you have to know that there are style properties that coincide with each part of the box. For example, the dimensions of your content are dictated by whatever you set for the width and height CSS property. The amount of padding is done by the padding property. The amount of border by the border property, and the amount of margin by the margin property. When you look behind the scenes in your browser by using developer tools or pressing F12, you will see that every element is represented sort of like this. The inner box is the content, and then you've got your padding, your top, left, right, and bottom padding. You've got your top, left, right, and bottom border, and then the space between elements, the so-called margin, you've got a top, left, right, and bottom of that as well. So these are all the parts of the CSS Box Model, and to set them, to configure the size of each part of the box, you use width, height, padding, border, and margin respectively. There's your width, there's your height, there's your padding, there's your border, and there's your margin. Let's take a look at what it looks like in our code. So down below I have the HTML, two div generic containers, and I've assigned them a class called Box Model. And what I've done is I've set all of these properties I just talked about. I set width, height, padding, border, and margin. And over here on the screen, these are the two divs represented visually. So notice how the content is surrounded by optional areas. of padding, border, and margin. All of these areas do consume space, but you'll see that my content 1, right, it has padding, then border, and then there's margin between it and its content 2 brethren. So this is trying to give you a concrete example of how the CSS box model is used in real life. There's your padding, there's your border, and then the space in between elements, that's what we call our margin. So you can determine the exact size of any HTML element using this CSS box model concept as your guide. The width of any element will be the width of its content plus its optional padding plus its optional border plus its optional margin. Likewise, the height of any element will be the summation of the content's height, its optional padding, its optional border, and its optional margin. So if you sum up the size of each area, you will get the exact size of any element. So to calculate the space, I have an example here. Let's say I have the box down below. It has content, padding, border, and margin. In order for me to calculate the width and height of this element, all I have to do is sum up each one of the pieces. So for width, I have 400 for my content. I have 20 pixels of padding on either side. I have 6 pixels of border on either side, and I have 20 pixels of margin on either side. When I sum all that up, I get 492. If I wanted to determine the exact height of this particular element right here, I would start with the 100, which is my content height. I would add 20 on each side for padding, 6 on each side for border, and then margin on the top and the bottom. When I do that, I get 192. So this is an example of how you can use the CSS box model to calculate the exact size that an element is and what space it will consume on a page. I've got a cool video I want you to watch here. This gets into some of the advancements that we've seen around the CSS box model, in particular, how box sizing and box shadow can be used. Make sure you're able to answer these 3 questions before you move on. I also want you to take a close look at the Mozilla Developer Network. They have a great article, they have great resources on the CSS box model. So make sure you read that and you take a look at each diagram and examine it closely. Other than that, as always, every lecture for web design has a hands-on component where you get to try out these things in real life. So I have a short thimble project for you, which is called the box model. Use the tutorial to complete it, and when you're done, you're going to publish and submit it as a grade.